How silence resets the balance of power. Silence is often mistaken for hesitation, weakness, or lack of control, but in reality it is one of the few forces capable of resetting power dynamics once they become unstable, overheated, or hostile. When power speaks constantly, it locks itself into positions. When it responds quickly, it surrenders tempo. And when it explains repeatedly, it teaches others how to pressure it. Silence interrupts all of that. To understand why silence matters today, we need to recognize how modern power becomes distorted. Attention accelerates everything. Reactions are demanded instantly. Positions harden before strategy has time to form. In this environment, speaking feels necessary. Silence feels dangerous. But that instinct is wrong. The sheiks learn that silence does something speech cannot. It collapses momentum. When power stops responding, the rhythm breaks. Questions lose sequence. Criticism loses coordination. Pressure loses timing. This is not passive. It is disruptive. Silence forces others to reveal urgency. Those who need answers expose dependency. Those who demand response expose leverage attempts. Power regains advantage simply by waiting. Historically, silence belonged to those with nothing to lose. Today, it belongs to those with the most control. Among elite sheiks, silence is used not to avoid conflict, but to reshape it. Conversations slow. Negotiations drift. Opposition fragments. Because without response, alignment collapses. Silence also removes hierarchy from interaction. When power does not speak, others speak to each other instead. Contradictions emerge. Narratives compete. Unity dissolves. This redistribution of pressure is intentional. Rather than absorbing conflict directly, silence redirects it outward. Those applying pressure turn on one another. Those demanding clarity lose consensus. And power watches without engagement. This is the opening truth. Silence does not resolve conflict. It resets it. It drains urgency, scrambles coordination, and reclaims time. But silence is not infinite. Used carelessly, it invites escalation. Used without movement, it signals absence. The mastery lies in pairing silence with quiet action, and that balance would soon determine whether silence could continue resetting power or whether it would trigger a confrontation it could no longer avoid. When silence is applied deliberately and sustained with discipline, it begins to change the emotional geometry of power, because the side that speaks less slowly regains control over time, rhythm, and expectation, while others exhaust themselves reacting to an absence they cannot influence. At first, silence creates discomfort. People expect response. They prepare arguments. They wait for acknowledgement. But waiting is expensive. Every unanswered question consumes attention. Every delayed reply drains momentum. And every unanswered demand weakens the authority of the one making it. The sheiks understood that silence does not merely pause interaction. It reverses dependence. Those demanding answers begin revealing urgency. Those applying pressure expose timelines. And timelines are leverage points. When silence stretches long enough, the balance flips. What began as pressure becomes impatience. What began as confidence becomes anxiety. And what began as accusation becomes negotiation. Silence forces others to fill the space. They speculate. They contradict themselves. They escalate without coordination. This fragmentation is not accidental. Power benefits when opposition loses alignment. When critics argue among themselves. When narratives compete instead of converging. Silence turns a single adversarial front into scattered voices. At the same time, silence creates psychological asymmetry. Those who speak feel exposed. Those who remain quiet feel protected. Speech commits. Silence preserves optionality. The sheiks use silence to let situations ripen. They allowed emotions to peak and decay. They waited until urgency exhausted itself. By the time engagement resumed, the emotional charge had vanished. This is how silence resets the field. Not by winning arguments, but by letting them burn out. However, silence must be active beneath the surface. While nothing is said publicly, decisions continue privately. Positions are reinforced. Alternatives are prepared. Silence is paired with preparation. This creates a decisive asymmetry. Outsiders experience stillness. Insiders experience motion. By the time silence breaks, the outcome is already shaped. But silence carries a threshold. If extended too long, without visible consequence, it can be misread as paralysis. If repeated without results, it loses credibility. The sheiks knew that silence must eventually resolve into action, not explanation. And that moment, when silence finally gives way, is where power reasserts itself most clearly. Because when silence ends, it does not answer questions. It changes reality. The conflict emerges when silence stops merely unsettling opponents and begins to attract direct challenge. Because at a certain point, absence is no longer read as patience, but tested as resolve. This is a dangerous phase. Pressure becomes intentional rather than reactive. Silence is no longer met with speculation alone. It is met with provocation. Deadlines are announced publicly. Consequences are threatened indirectly. Escalation is framed as unavoidable. The goal is simple: force silence to speak. The sheiks understood this tactic well. They knew that when silence is challenged openly, any response would restore tempo to the challenger and collapse the advantage silence had created. So they did something counterintuitive. They allowed pressure to peak. They let accusations circulate unchecked. They let urgency amplify itself. They let narratives harden without correction. This was not neglect. It was exposure. Because when pressure escalates without resistance, it reveals its true nature. Emotional, impatient, overextended. Those applying pressure begin contradicting themselves. Allies disagree on framing. Timelines shift publicly. Silence becomes a mirror. The louder the challenge grows, the more desperation becomes visible. And desperation weakens legitimacy. At the same time, silence preserves flexibility. No commitments are made. No positions are fixed. No future moves are constrained. This asymmetry matters. Challengers invest political and emotional capital publicly. Power invests nothing visibly. If pressure succeeds, power can respond from stillness. If pressure fails, challengers have already exposed their limits. Either outcome favors silence. But this phase carries the greatest risk. Extended silence under direct challenge can fracture internal confidence. Allies may waver. Partners may hesitate. The sheiks managed this by separating audiences. Public silence continued. Private reassurance intensified. Channels remained open where it mattered. Alignment was maintained quietly. No one inside the system doubted direction. This distinction was critical. Silence was never meant for insiders. It was meant for adversaries. As pressure reached its peak, the system was ready, not to explain, not to argue, but to move. Because silence alone does not end conflict. It prepares the moment when action restores balance completely. And that moment, when silence finally gives way, is where power delivers its sharpest response. Not with words, but with irreversible outcomes. The climax arrives when silence finally resolves into action, not explanation. Because the moment power moves without warning, without justification, and without dialogue, the entire balance resets instantly. This is where silence completes its work. After pressure has exhausted itself, after narratives have fractured, after urgency is burned out, action arrives calmly and decisively. There are no announcements, no rebuttals, no acknowledgments of the conflict that preceded it. Reality simply changes. This is a revelation. Silence was never meant to persuade. It was meant to reposition. By the time action occurs, opponents are out of sync. Their expectations are outdated. Their leverage is gone. They prepared for reaction. They receive outcome. That asymmetry is overwhelming because action that arrives without explanation cannot be negotiated. It cannot be reframed. It cannot be slowed. The sheiks understood that words invite delay. They open space for reinterpretation. They allow resistance to reorganize. Action closes that space entirely. Once the move is made, conversation becomes irrelevant. Adaptation replaces debate. This is how silence resets power permanently. Not by silencing others, but by rendering their voices untimely. Afterward, critics ask what happened. Analysts search for turning points. Narratives attempt reconstruction, but reconstruction comes too late. The outcome has already shaped the next phase. Paths have narrowed. Options have disappeared. Silence did not end conflict. How